Well, hello there and welcome to Rare Classic Cars again here from the tranquil setting out in nature. It's a beautiful day, about 50 degrees. Salt's still on the road though, so we're still gonna have to wait a little bit before we get back to the road tests. So I thought, I've been talking a lot about the best and worst engines of some of the domestic companies. And I think some people, we talked about the Iron Duke 4-cylinder in a previous video, and some people got really upset. It's not the worst engine. It's unrefined, but it's reliable. That was exactly the point, by the way. But just because something works doesn't mean that it's pleasant. It doesn't mean that it makes people buy vehicles or leave with positive impressions. Yes, if you had one in your S10 pickup, you're a pickup owner, your expectation of refinement is much different from somebody buying a relatively expensive car, like an Omega Brougham or a Century Limited or something like that. In any case, let's put that aside and let's talk about a foreign engine that I've owned, and it's the Honda E-Series 4-cylinder, and I had one in my 1985 Honda CRX hatchback. And to me, this is probably the worst engine to own now, at least, as a Honda, and I'll tell you why. So first, let me get out of the way that this is a gem of a little 4-cylinder when it's running right. My CRX was an absolute hoot when it is running right. Extremely smooth, makes wonderful noises for a 4-cylinder powertrain. I don't know how Honda did that. Probably low reciprocating mass of the various pieces, revved very easily to 6,000 RPM, and it was happy doing it. The steering wheel and the interior trim bits didn't come alive. Idle was so smooth and quiet that it was really tough to beat. Honda was at their zenith, I think, in that late 80s, early 90s time period, and this was approaching it. But there's one huge problem with that vehicle and that engine, especially today. And that is the carburetor control and the number of vacuum lines and solenoids that control everything under the hood. So on this engine, it's so bad that Honda spent a few extra yen to print on the vacuum lines the numbers of them. And they correspond to various vacuum hoses in a vacuum diagram, which I'll show you. Take a look. That is the real vacuum diagram. That is how many hoses there are. They are all over the place in this engine compartment. And yes, the domestic companies had cars and had vacuum hoses and all that. I have never seen anything like this. I've never seen that many hoses. I've never seen that many underhood, they called them control boxes, with different solenoids in them. I haven't seen that complicated of this is a 3-barrel carburetor, which really was getting impossible to find parts for when I had my Honda CRX. And in general, it was getting impossible to find parts for this car. And that's really why I soured on it after a while. I love the car. It was a really fun blue color, blue interior, 15,000 miles, so really low mileage. And when it ran, it was a sweetheart. But every year there was some, now that the car, is approaching close to 40 years old, there was something that would go wrong with it. And it was just a bear to trace down and find what in the world was wrong with it. So the vacuum situation on these vehicles is awful. The worst I've seen in mainstream vehicles. And I would highly advise, if you're going to get a Honda from this time period, to find one like there was the CRX, which I had the regular CRX. I did not have the SI. The SI had a fuel-injected engine. I strongly advise you go for the fuel-injected Honda engines, not the carburetors, because it's getting really tough to find parts. And beyond that, the carburetor mounting gaskets would leak. The intake gaskets would sometimes leak. The engine was all aluminum, and they were known to, in some cases, if they overheated, they would have head gasket issues. It's the only car that I've had in the modern era, too, where if you shut it off, the fan will keep running even after you shut the car off, until the coolant temperature cools down. So some cars will do that if it's really hot. But this one, if the temperature gauge were about above the mid-range, that's what would happen if I were driving it and I'd shut the car down. But I just wanted to share that I've talked, I think, a lot about the domestic engines. To me, if you want to own one of these now, you're in for a bit of a headache, to be honest. And on top of that, yes, it's a sweetheart of an engine when it's running, and the manual transmission is great. But it is a significant headache to keep these going and to keep them running at optimum, the optimum levels. I mean, just as an example, on an American car of the era, to get to the carburetor, you'd usually undo one wing nut. Maybe you've got one vacuum line for the heat stove on the air cleaner, and you unhook that. Take off the wing nut. You take off the air cleaner, and there's the carburetor right there. Not so on this car. Even just to get the air cleaner off was a chore. It had about 3 or 4 different clamps around the perimeter of the air cleaner. It also had a center wing nut. It did have the vacuum hose to the heat stove tube, but then it also had a few bolts that ran in to secure it to the engine. So you had to take all that off just to get the air cleaner off. And then once you got the air cleaner off, the carburetor had like a little screen on top of it to protect things from going inside, which I suppose was a good idea, but just another thing that you got to take off. And then the cables and the vacuum hoses and the various solenoids on this, it drove me nuts because it was so great when it was running. And then if I had an issue at the start of the year, I just almost didn't want to fix it because I knew it was going to take a long time to troubleshoot it. And then once I troubleshot it, I knew it was going to take a long time to find the part just to replace it. So my best advice is, and also I would say on these, remember these have a timing belt. And at this age, no matter the miles, mine has 17,000 miles, I replaced the timing belt, and you always want to do the water pump with the timing belt. I'm not a big fan of timing belts either. I tend to like timing chains, although it seems like on some of the cars these days, the timing chain guides and tensioners also have issues. But I would prefer a chain over a belt. So potential head gasket issues if it overheats, watch out. A bear to maintain with all the vacuum lines and solenoids and control boxes under the hood. So watch out there. Tough to tune with this 3-barrel Keyhind carburetor that not easy to find parts for anymore, but can be very rewarding when it is running right. So in my opinion, at least in the modern day, that is the most challenging, I'll call it, and frankly worst Honda engine. Honda makes a lot of great engines, and this was, generally speaking, a great engine, just had a number of flaws associated with it. It was also the child of the CVCC system that Honda developed, I think it's controlled vortex combustion chamber, or something like that. But it has a pre-chamber where a rich fuel air charge would go in with a little intake valve, and then that would ignite next to the spark plug while a leaner mixture is coming in the main intake valve. And Honda did that back in the 70s so they could avoid having a catalytic converter on some cars because they were able to get such a clean burn out of that system. So a lot of genius things on this engine, but it's a challenge to own now, and that's why it makes my list of worst engines of all time. Remember, worst doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad, but it means that it is a challenge and you should be aware. And I just thought I'd share that with folks who are looking for one of these classic Hondas. And also, I will say, be aware of super paper thin sheet metal. These things rust really easy. And if you go for a CRX, watch out for the plastic fenders. I remember the other thing I didn't like about this car is you couldn't work on it and lean anywhere. You had to be very careful about where you positioned your body weight. Because I put my hand on the fender and leaned on it to do something, and it cracked the fender because it's plastic. I just had enough. But maybe somebody else will enjoy it. It was a nice car, it was a fun car, and somebody else is enjoying it because I sold it. In any case, hope you enjoyed this porch chat from, again, the Tranquil setting on Honda engines. Thanks again, and until next time, take care. Thanks for watching this porch chat on Honda's E-Series 4-cylinder with all the vacuum hoses. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure that you like, subscribe, and throw a few comments down in the comment section, as that helps YouTube serve this up to more people like you. And if you're not yet subscribed, what are you waiting for? Click the circular icon of the 67 Buick Riviera at the top left. And also be sure to check out more of this Best of Worst of Porch Chat series by clicking the playlist at the bottom right, or a video that YouTube is serving up for you at the bottom left. Until the next time, thanks again and take care.